So, and every time you say that, what could get worse? Things always seem to get worse. So I don't think we want to ask that question too loudly without maybe knocking on wood first. But this morning we're going to have a conversation about another uplifting and fun issue 101 in patent eligibility and what it's doing for the life sciences industry. And joining us here for this conversation is Vince Shearer, and Vince is a partner at Haynes Boone. Vince has a PhD. He does this type of work. He's one of the co-chairs for the program. He, along with Sherry and Stephanie, who you'll meet later on if you don't know her already, have really helped mold this program starting all the way back in, I guess, February or March of this year. So, Vince, before we go into the topic du jour about 101, I want to just throw open-ended. Any thoughts that you'd like to say about what you heard yesterday?
Yeah, I think you hit it spot on. Uplifting, that's the one word that I think we can all take away from it. I was really appreciative for the panel that Emily, Corey, and Arthur gave yesterday. I think it's one of these things that flew under the radar for all of us, is the impact of the IRA and the impact that it's having on the pharmaceutical industry, and sort of forward thinking of the shift from small molecules into biologics. I think it's often overlooked. I think certainly from a societal viewpoint, it's one of these things that's not politicized enough, and I'm really appreciative for that panel in particular. I wish it were uplifting, but it really, I think it sets a tone for today in not all the right ways, but it's entirely fitting and proper. I think that we start today's discussion with patent eligible subject matter and continuing sort of the tone of doom and gloom, in particular in the way it impacts life sciences.
Yeah, no doubt. And we were actually just talking very briefly ourselves, and the language that is used, that is the other side controls it, and we heard this yesterday about what's wrong with negotiating. Of course, negotiating seems fair. I mean, this is sort of a negotiation like you do with The Godfather, right? It's like giving you an offer you can't refuse, literally. Because if you refuse it, you're going to take the company away with ruinous $40, $50 billion fines. So the language that's used is so critically important. And in this area, to dive into the 101 area, it's confounding on a very basic level, particularly in the life sciences area, ever since Justice Thomas said discoveries are not patent eligible, when in fact the Constitution and the statute says exactly the opposite. Where do you see us presently with 101? Good, bad, ugly, somewhere in between, hopeful?
Yeah, I'd rather ask the other question. I'd rather take the cannoli. Yeah. Where we stand right now is certainly a state of tremendous flux, and with great concern looking forward. You cite to Thomas's statement, about discoveries, and what is a discovery at the end of the day? I mean, basically what we're looking at is scientific principles, natural products. This stuff affects directly the life sciences industry, perhaps more than any other industry. I think where we look at the decisions that we saw over the last decade, one thing that comes to mind for me is that the Supreme Court has chosen to follow the wrong turn. Sherry made reference to Funk Brothers yesterday. It's sort of this right turn or left turn, wrong turn, however you want to look at it. It took us away from the bedrock principles of patent eligibility that we lived under for 200 years. We really lived sort of this blissful peace post Chakrabarty and Deere. We, at least in life sciences, we knew where the boundaries were, and most everything passed what was supposed to be a liberal gatekeeper. 101 was never intended to be a strict exclusionary rule. It was really a liberal gatekeeper that if you could fall within these generic boxes, aside from a handful of perhaps exceptions, you should be allowed to go forward. But now where we stand today is we have all these boundaries that we don't know where they really are set. Where's the foundation? What moves? Senator Tillis and Senator Coons, when they put forth the current proposed, we'll talk about PARA a little bit, but in PARA they call it out in the preamble. Right? There's a tremendous concern, there's tremendous alarm even amongst the courts. They don't know what to follow. They don't know what the limitations are in Section 101. Where that shows up is dramatic inconsistencies, and where we now are sort of at is anything patentable, especially in our particular area. I think back to some of the past decisions, and they were very clear historically. When we go back to Leroy v. Tatham, we look at Mitchell v. Tillman, like some of these old historic cases that told us things like the scientific principles or the scientific discovery, if it's applied in a new and useful way, that's patent eligible, all right? Funk Brothers is really what changed that, and we started getting to what now in Mayo, where they look at Funk and they look at Fluke, and now they're saying everything rides us on this inventive concept. Right? What does that really mean, and where did we bring that into play? And I look at the Supreme Court and how they've sort of set things up, and we all know how much Gene loves a good analogy. I kind of look at what the Supreme Court did over the last decade in Bilski and Alice, Myriad, Mayo. It's everything seemed peaceful. Right? It's kind of like that water park. All the children are off playing, they're swimming, everything's great. The Supreme Court comes just strolling in with an alligator under its arm and throws it into the pool, grabs some popcorn, sits back and says, "Ha-ha, let's see what happens." And that's what we're seeing now. When we see interactive wearables, we see Trope, we see American Axle, we just saw Caradex. They don't want to touch this anymore. And so they just kind of lob this alligator in there, and everybody's frantically panicking, and nobody knows where we're going. None of the courts do. And so where do we stand now? Well, where we stand is Supreme Court sitting on the sideline watching. And I know of at least one other case. The Chromadex case is pending. The cert petition's pending. Where is that one going to go? I don't think they're going to touch it. So where do we go? Where do we stand? What are we looking at in the future? PARA is the first good step. We've seen this now. This is the third straight Congress that that some type of patent eligibility reform has been introduced. Tillis and Coons have been the leaders of this effort, and although we can all debate whether or not it's gone far enough, does it really touch the right issues? Is it good for one industry but not good for another? But that's a spirited debate we need to have. It's kind of, I think of it as the strange bedfellows. If you look a couple weeks ago in Law 360, there was an article co-authored by Kevin Noonan and Jonathan Stroud. Talk about strange bedfellows. I don't typically think of them being on the same side of this issue. But what they did say was, look, regardless of where you are, regardless of how you view this, whether you're in the software industry or in life sciences, very different of views on what and how strict patent eligibility should be. What it has done, regardless of industry, has stunted innovation. Right? This is exactly the concept that our panelists yesterday, and I see Emily right here, I don't see Corey, but it was the same concepts they kept bringing up, is where is this going to leave us when we start looking at innovation in bringing life-saving technologies forward, whether it's small molecules, is it medical diagnostics, is it other types of life-saving and life-changing technologies that we deal with on a daily basis in the life sciences. If you can't get protection, you're not going to invest in it. If small companies can't get venture capital and other types of support, they're not going to pursue it. It's basic economics. And what we're running into is a scenario where without some kind of congressional intervention to clean up and fix some of these issues, we're not going to get there. And that's what Stroud and Noonan were trying to get at, is regardless of what the answer is, we want clarity.
So the cynical view of why Jonathan Stroud would be saying that is there's not enough patents getting issued, so that means there's not enough patents for Unified to challenge. So we have to rectify that situation and get more patents issued, so we can take them out later after the fact on IPR. And that's probably unfair, but the older I get, the more I see an awful lot of interesting self-dealing and self-interest, and there's nothing wrong with promoting your self-interest. I think all too often, though, the decision makers, and maybe particularly more the courts, where they are much more naive about this, it seems, fall into believing they're getting arguments that are legitimate and not advocacy. And I find that difficult to swallow, because in Congress, right? I mean, there's people coming in and talking to you and lobbying you on both sides of the issue. You know what their position is. You know who they represent. But in the courts, this strange character called an amicus brief hides an awful lot. You get enough professors that will sign on to what you want them to say, or you get this industry organization, that industry organization, and it creates this air of unanimity among the industry where there really ought not to be any unanimity. And that's frustrating for me, because and I've said over and over again, and I'm preaching to the choir with the people in this room, but you can't be on the sidelines anymore. If there was ever a time in the patent world where you could be on the sidelines, it certainly hasn't been over the last 15 years, and getting more and more involved is only more important. Maybe along that line, could you tell us a little bit about, from your perspective with your clients, how their behavior has changed over, like, say, the last decade since we've been living with a Mayo Myriad world?
Yeah, I think it's going to differ on the basis of the size of the company. Different companies take different approaches. But what we're finding is that companies, especially smaller ones, because their budgets are so constrained now, they can't get the same type of investment. Their strategies tend to favor more holding things as trade secrets for longer. Rolling out some of their stuff in the diagnostic space, for example, they're just not investing in that area as much. And those that are finding it more and more challenging, not just to get patents, but ultimately, what is the value that they can attribute to those? Because you can't project a confidence when you start looking at whether these would ever stand up. How can I assert these? We're beyond the question of how do I detect infringement, right? Which is typically in a method claim one of the big things we worry about. Like, what are those blaze marks I can look for that would tell me whether or not somebody's infringing? Now we're in this realm of, well, even if I do, what's the point? Do I want to invest $5-6 million just to find out my patent is worthless? So there's decisions that are being made at a very early stage of what do you take forward, what do you keep secret, and what do you invest in.
So, but that's not a problem, right? I mean, because I can look at you and tell what's wrong with you. I don't need
too many things for us to go through.
Okay, that probably didn't come out exactly as I was intended. But what I mean is I could tell just by, like, mental energy, thinking really hard that, okay, well, you've got this ailment or you have that ailment. I don't need a test. I don't need a medical diagnostic. And if I think you're maybe sick, then I'll just give you a dozen or 2 or 3 dozen pills, and maybe one of these will work, and maybe you don't need any of them. That's fine, right? You'll be okay with that.
Well, I think, let's go back to Myriad, right? It's one of those premises that was tested in Myriad. Right? One of the big issues there is we're looking at certain biomarkers and whether it's indicative of one type of cancer that may be better treated by one certain drug versus another. So what we start getting into is personalized medicine. Right?
So we need Karnak to tell us what's wrong with you, because we can't get new medical diagnostics because the Supreme Court said they're not patent eligible. So now almost nobody is actually doing research. The Cleveland Clinic is giving up on medical diagnostics, one of the premier research hospitals in the United States. The hospital that people who are royalty in other countries fly to for treatment has given up medical diagnostics. I mean, when you say it out loud, I just got to chill. When I say it out loud, it's like so blatantly obvious that we are on the wrong path. And you can't possibly know what's wrong with somebody unless you can detect it. And you can't detect a new disease unless you research ways to figure out new disease, right?
Well, it's like we started with, this is an uplifting conversation.
Yeah.
Yeah. We heard it yesterday as well from Amgen and Novartis. It's not just about the front end, right? It's also about now the treatments, right? What drugs can we bring to market? How do we invest in that, right? Even if we start looking at these when we go back to the discovery, if they're small molecules or biologics, they could arguably be derived from or a product of some natural process or natural product. So we're getting hit not just in diagnostic space, but we're also getting hit under sort of the Myriad kind of scenario where we're starting to look more and more at, well, is it markedly different characteristics? Well, what does that really mean? And how do I bring that forward? And you look at decisions like in Chromadex and what we're looking at in terms of what was at issue there. Like, your claim almost has to become sort of an indicia of these different characteristics or advantages that you provide over the art, or you don't get the patents. But that also constrains as a scope, it constrains your abilities to use them, but it also leads to stunted innovation. It leads to less investment in these areas where we need them most. As we look at an aging population, we look at where we're falling behind a lot of other countries with introduction of new medicines, new types of care. And so it goes again to what Arthur was talking about yesterday. One of the big issues that we seem to be putting blinders on is the impact, and not just us in this room, I think we all get it, but society and our lawmakers. What's going on in the legislative and judicial branches when it comes to patents, when it comes to things like the IRA and the impacts we saw on price negotiations? What it's ending up doing is shifting more and more costs to the taxpayers. It's causing a lower quality of medical care, and it's increasing dramatically the costs and burdens on the system, because now we're not into life-saving treatments or the ability for early diagnosis to avoid those costs. We're shifting more into a position where we're just managed care at the end of life. And whether you're 40 or you're 80, we're talking, I think we heard the statistic yesterday, 2 weeks stay in the ICU ending with fatality is over almost $1 million. So we'd rather be paying that than turning that money back into investment and innovation to provide us with diagnostics that can perhaps allow us to catch something at age 40 and be able to treat it with a particular new drug that's on the market that can address that particular problem.
Yeah, I suppose that the ray of sunshine here, or the happy moment, is that it's often darkest right before the dawn. And it's pretty dark right now. And it has surprised me that, just not in just this area, but this area has been particularly hard hit. But across the board for innovation, we haven't yet come to terms with, we had a recipe that worked. We had a recipe that others copied. Europe looks a lot more like we did now about 15 or 20 years ago. And we're going the opposite direction. And at some point in time, I just thought that the powers that be would realize that, no, we enjoyed all this prosperity and all this innovation because of this stuff, not in spite of it. And at some point, and I don't know when that is, I don't know where the pivot moment is, it seems like it's going to have to turn around, because we know that if it doesn't turn around, these companies are going to make different decisions. And I full well expect a lot of the pharmaceutical industry to go out of business. Right now, it's only a problem with the IRA, a problem with 10 drugs. But they're so confident in their ignorance and stupidity that they're already talking about expanding it. And they're going to expand it to more drugs. And once you have price controls, that's a very slippery slope. So I think it's going to affect a lot of people in the industry. And between that and the 101 area, they're really forcing innovation into a small relatively useless channel. And I say relatively useless because it's not like it's going to be completely useless. But I was just talking before we started here today, you as a pharmaceutical company are better off, I think, hitting a single or a double than hitting a home run. And certainly you don't want to hit a grand slam home run because that's when all the questions come. If you can fly under the radar, make a good living hitting singles and doubles, nobody's going to ask too many questions. But then you have to layer on 101 on top of that and say, okay, well, there's a whole lot of singles and doubles that were available 15 years ago that just are no longer available. And it closes the window even further.
Well, one of the greatest hitters of our time was Ichiro.
Yeah.
It's all singles and doubles, right?
Right.
I think there's a lot of truth to that. And in the meantime, it's kind of like, I almost feel like, I feel the same way. Right, there's a pendulum. We swung it, in some people's view, too far one direction. Now it's swung back the other way. It's going to take time, but that pendulum is going to come back. Where does that come back? Well, it's things like Brad Watts was talking about yesterday. Right? It takes time. Right? It takes time to push legislation through, but that's the fix here. The courts have made a clear signal they're not going to clean this up. They're not going to reverse course. We're not going to see some kind of revision that's going to take back what was going on in Alice and what happened out of Mayo and Myriad. None of that. The toothpaste not going back in the tube. And so what we need to look at is alternatives. And it's really voices, right? As Brad was talking yesterday and others were talking, it's about getting our voices heard in the right channels. And where that is talking to our congressman. There is now 3 straight terms where we've had some patent eligibility reform put on the table. The latest is the 2023 version of the Patent Eligibility Restoration Act. Right, that is the best step forward, and when you compare it to what was in the 2022 version, we really see tremendous changes. One is that Tillis is getting really frustrated. Right? It plays out in the preamble. He's making it clear that's not for John Smith and Sally Sue at home. Who that's for is his fellow congressmen. It is a clear signal that something has to happen. Right? These are the problems. And he goes through in the preamble in a few very succinct statements about the frustrations in the industry, the frustrations and the confusion in the courts, and how this has to be addressed. And then he summarizes that statement with those beautiful words that Sherry Knowles was talking about, right? About the restriction or elimination of the prior judicial exceptions.
Yeah.
Right? Now, where does that go? I mean, how far does that really extend? Like, if you read it in its broadest concept, did we just gut Diamond v. Deere and we just took out laws of nature and everything else? Well, if you read it on its face, yeah, it did. So we've kind of set things back. It's also in the preamble. So what effect does that have? So there's movement that needs to happen. But when you look at the way it's laid out and you compare that to the 2022 version, we've made progress. We've made tremendous progress towards finding a way that overrules decisions like Myriad and Mayo and gets us away from sort of this world where we're currently existing, which is doom and gloom. Now, do I think something's going to happen in this session? No. We're in a presidential election year. That's not going to happen. I think most places you read, most people you talk to, whether they're staffers or whether they're other people just in our community, the expectation is that's just going to sit in committee and they're not going to touch it until post-election. All right, so we're probably looking at another version maybe reintroduced.
Right.
But it's our opportunity to continue to push this dialogue and why things are needed, regardless of which side you're on. Right? It's hard when we have one system of patent laws to satisfy everyone. So those in the software space or those doing artificial intelligence, they're not going to have the same view of 101. They may look at the way it's being put together now and say this is great. We talked about iMac yesterday. I mean, they got to be loving this. But we have to find a balance and some kind of progress where we can strike some kind of balance between these competing interests And the 2023 version is the closest we're getting. And I think as we continue to push through the right channels, continue to talk, continue to put out the things like this program right here is going to continue to put a face and a voice to this. And so I think there are brighter days ahead. Do I think it's 2023? No, definitely. Is it 2024? Almost certainly not. But as we move a couple of years forward, I do think we're going to see eligibility reform. The question is what it's going to look like. And I would love to see some kind of change that prohibits the use of the inventive concept test, looking at the elements of the claim. Let's get back to the concept of scientific discoveries applied in a practical and useful way are patent eligible.
Yeah. Like the Constitution and the statute currently says, but it gets ignored. It is very frustrating. There's a lot of frustration. There's some reason for hope. I do think that we're looking at 2025 or maybe 2026 before anything gets actually enacted. I would agree with you. I don't see the courts coming to their senses between now and then, unfortunately. And what I can tell you is just in covering things, as we get into the end of Q3 2024, there will be nothing happen in the government. There will be gag orders placed on the agencies. There will be only the most essential bills will even get any oxygen starting September 1st, maybe even August 1st. And so we have a very short window. So that's why it seems extremely unlikely we're going to get it this year. And it's unlikely we're going to get a lot of things, right? We've all been talking about the PTAB bill that Director Vidal has been working on. Every day that doesn't come out, it makes it more exponentially more unlikely because of the timelines. And OMD has to pass it. And these are government realities, and they don't fit very nice into the innovation world or into the innovation life cycle or the needs of clients. So before I let you go, and we move on to the next panel here, what are you telling your clients in the meantime?
Don't lose faith. Continue to write their applications. We make the decisions more on one of trade secret versus patent protection, but we keep things alive. It takes a long time to get these applications through. We're still writing for Europe. We talked about that Europe's still much more favorable, at least right now, in a lot of these spaces than the U.S. So we really can't change sort of our style and approach. The things that we add in are some of these sub-elements that might withstand a greater scrutiny in the U.S. or give us exit clauses on narrower claims today, but we might be able to pursue something broader a few years down the road, putting aside the select decision, which we'll talk about later. But we try to play this for the long game, especially applications we're putting together now. Plan for the short term. Let's look Europe. Let's look Japan. Let's look other jurisdictions that make sense. And we're writing more for a standard for those countries, but then filling out those applications for the U.S. with additional steps that maybe we can bring in. But the real thing is keep things alive, keep looking down the road. If we're writing today, we're not probably looking at examination of that case in most of these spaces until post-2024 elections. We're probably looking at 2025 before a lot of this stuff sees the light of day. We might be in a completely different world by then. So keep the faith, keep writing, keep pursuing in making strategic decisions, but let's not panic about what we think is going to be an overly restrictive area, and so we can't afford not to continue to pursue applications in thinking written description enablement, the antibody space, thinking about 101 diagnostic space. It's really a question of where we want to allocate resources and how broad we want to cast those and what we think our return is in other jurisdictions.
Great. Well, thanks a lot, Vince. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
So if I can ask